Welcome to Alzheimer's Talks, a monthly teleconference series presented by Us Against Alzheimer's, where we connect you with the leaders in research and policy, and today, the arts, who are working to stop or reduce the stigma of Alzheimer's. My name is George Vredenberg, and I am chairman and co-founder of Us Against Alzheimer's, which we regard as an entrepreneurial startup, but a disruptive organization seeking to change the trajectory of Alzheimer's, seeking to change business as usual. Our organization, Us Against Alzheimer's, is made up of people from all walks of life and all segments of American society, people like you, researchers, women, African Americans, Latinos, caregivers, CEOs, clergy members, and everyone in between, because this disease affects everyone. That's why we call ourselves Us Against Alzheimer's. This fight is going to involve all of us. Defeating this disease is going to be a team sport. Thank you for joining us today to hear more about how the arts, and specifically poetry and storytelling, might help those with Alzheimer's. We have a great panel today of Sunil, Iyengar, Gary Glazner, and Basting, and Kate Medeiros, and I'll introduce each of them sequentially in just a moment. We've been very busy since last month's Alzheimer's Talks. The Energy and Commerce Committee of the United States House of Representatives has released a second and indeed today a third draft of the much-anticipated 21st Century Cures legislation. It will go through markup tomorrow in the subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee. This bill would accelerate the discovery, the development, and delivery cycle, promising new treatments and getting cures to patients more quickly. It would also increase funding and create a special $10 billion innovation fund for the National Institutes of Health. This is a promising movement from Congress, especially since the bill has bipartisan support, but there's still work to do both in the House, and we still have to get the Senate moving in the same direction. Recently, just in the last month, we've heard many politicians, both in private meetings and publicly, speak out on the importance of increased attention and funding for Alzheimer's. In the Senate, Senator Susan Collins, Senator Jim Webb, or former Senator Jim Webb, Patty Murray, Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi, Senator Cassidy of Louisiana, Senator Bennett of Colorado, Senator Wyden of Oregon, Senator Burr of North Carolina, and indeed some of the announced presidential candidates have been speaking about the issue, specifically Jeb Bush and Mike Huckabee. Hillary Clinton was the co-chair of the Alzheimer's caucus when she served in the United States Senate, and I know from personal conversations that she's fully aware of the Alzheimer's issues and is committed to addressing them. And prior, maybe even teaser presidential candidates, Newt Gingrich and Jim Webb, are speaking out about the issue. So this is beginning now to get a real momentum in the political world. That's terrific. As we all know, Prime Minister Cameron has led this issue for the last year and a half as Prime Minister of the UK, and he's recently got reelected. So that gives us a chance to continue his leadership on the global front as well. To get the latest updates on all this, please go to www.usagainStalzheimers.org and sign up if you haven't done that already. You'll get an email from us every week or so to take specific actions that, in fact, are causing this political groundswell and shift on this disease. It'll only take you about 10, 15 seconds to read an email and another 10 to 15 seconds to act. So this is not a big commitment of time, but joining the several 100,000 people who are now joined Us Against Alzheimer's, these numbers count. The Senate and House offices count these numbers. So getting everyone involved is so important. We know we can stop this disease, but we can't get there without your help. It's Us Against Alzheimer's, so please join us. We have almost 300 people registered for the call today from 39 states and the District of Columbia. Another 400 people couldn't join us today but asked specifically for the recap materials. We'll send everyone registered for the call today a summary as well as key links that we discussed today and the transcript and the recording. Remember, for those of you who've been on this, you've heard me say this before, if you have a question during the call, please press *3 on your phone. By pressing *3, you will be placed into the question queue. Please have your question ready to share briefly with a member of our staff. We'll try to get you live on the air as soon as possible with our panel when we open it up for questions. Or if you're listening to us online, you can type your question in the box on your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as possible after the opening presentations. So on to the panel. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce you initially first to Sunil Iyengar. Sunil is the Director of the Office of Research and Analysis at the National Endowment for the Arts, where he has worked for almost 9 years. He also chairs the National Endowment's Interagency Task Force on the Arts and Human Development. A key focus of their work has been the study of arts in relation to the health and well-being of older adults. He was very instrumental in putting together the panel you'll be hearing from today. So thank you again, Sunil, for being with us today, for helping us put this panel together, and most importantly, for recognizing the importance of the arts for those with dementia and their caregivers. So we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, George. It's an absolute pleasure to be on the line with you today and to precede my colleagues in the field, Gary, Ann, and Kate. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The National Endowment for the Arts, as an independent federal agency, strives to give Americans from all ages and backgrounds the opportunity to participate in the arts, to exercise their imaginations and develop their creative capacities. But for the purpose of this call, I want to note that Beth Bienvenu, Director of the NEA's Office of Accessibility, and I have paid close attention to that part of our grants portfolio and other arts projects throughout the nation that serve older Americans, especially projects or interventions that aim to improve their health and well-being and to mitigate the symptoms of chronic diseases such as the one we're talking about today. Indeed, that's how we first became aware of the wonderful work of the Alzheimer's Poetry Project and TimeSlips, two programs you'll hear about today. They're designed to help patients with dementia, including Alzheimer's, and importantly, their caregivers in coping with symptoms of such diseases. Besides programs that incorporate the arts, whether poetry and storytelling in this case, or in others, music, dance, theater, or the visual arts, besides monitoring these programs, we at the NEA have a strong research imperative. In 2011, we formed an interagency task force on the arts and human development, currently involving 19 entities across the federal government, to promote new research opportunities and information sharing about the arts' role in attaining positive health and educational outcomes across the lifespan. I mention this group because two key players have been the National Institute on Aging and the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, both at the National Institutes of Health, NIH. Together with other NIH components, these agencies co-sponsored a public research workshop with us, held at the National Academy of Sciences a few years ago, to examine the relationship between the arts and aging. The event saw speakers such as Kate de Medeiros, whom you'll be hearing from also today, talk about research challenges and opportunities in the field. In many cases, these were issues of profound importance to the Alzheimer's community. I invite you to look at the report from the National Academy of Sciences event, as well as a white paper on the arts and human development. Both, I understand, will be on the Alzheimer's Talks website if they aren't there already, along with a link to a blog that was written by Kate on research needs pertaining to the arts and Alzheimer's. Finally, I want to say that as a researcher and being a research director of the NEA, what a high privilege it is to talk directly with you, all of you who have been touched directly by Alzheimer's in some way, either as patients, caregivers, or in some other capacity. So often, maybe too often, we talk only to other researchers or policymakers or funders, but I'd like to see more direct lines of communications directly with the patients and the other stakeholders. So I truly welcome this opportunity given to us by Us Against Alzheimer's. And George, I know if you, as you said, I'm a research guy. I went on your website and I noticed that Us Against Alzheimer's has a theory of change. And one of the goals, in fact, that the organization hopes to advance is to bring dramatic improvements to the standards and systems of care for people living with Alzheimer's and those who care with them. So I would just urge everyone to think about how we can, how research is a key component of those standards and systems, and understanding how the arts can complement or advance therapies for Alzheimer's patients. So thank you very much.
You should know, Sunil, that we and over 100 organizations will be on Monday next sending a letter to the NIA, to the Secretary of HHS and to a number of other government agencies, suggesting a research summit on care and services. And so as that evolves, it very much seems in order to introduce NEA to that process. So thank you. Our first presenter is Gary Glazner. He is the founder and executive director of the Alzheimer's Poetry Project. His work has been featured in many places, including the Today Show, CNN, and NPR's Weekend Edition. Gary, thank you for joining us today. Please tell us a little bit more about your program.
Well, thank you, George and Sunil, and I want to thank everybody who's on the call today. So I want to tell you a little bit about how I started using poetry with people living with memory loss. It was 1997, and I got a small grant to give a series of workshops at an adult daycare center in Northern California. There was no instruction on what to do, just to somehow use poetry. There was a man in the group. His head was down. He wasn't participating. He was seemingly unaware of his surroundings. And I said the Longfellow poem. I shot an arrow into the air, and his eyes popped open, and he said, "It fell to earth, I knew not where." And suddenly he was with us and able to participate, and I was hooked. It showed me how powerful those classic poems could be and how useful poetry could be with this community. My experience as a caregiver began at that same time. My mother, Frankie, had terminal cancer. Brain tumors and morphine were causing dementia behavior. And my father, Billy, called one morning to say that my mom was very agitated and she was asking for cherry ice cream. And I knew this was a huge deal because my dad never asked for help. So I went and I got the ice cream, and as I was getting the bag out of the car, I saw the poetry books from the workshop, and I just thought, I'm going to bring them in and try them with my mom. My parents were childhood sweethearts. They became boyfriend and girlfriend at age 5 and 6. And as a child, my mother had teased my father with the rhyme, "Can she bake a cherry pie, Billy boy, Billy boy?" And it was one of the songs in the books that I had, and as I said it, my mother began to sing it and to do this little hand dance with her fingers. "Can she bake a cherry pie, Billy boy, Billy boy?" And it was a moment of joy and playfulness. My mom passed away shortly after that, and again, it reinforced to me how useful the arts could be, in this case with my own mom in hospice. I was and I remain inspired to make my life's work serving people living with memory loss. I started the Alzheimer's Poetry Project in 2003, and since that time, we've done programming in 25 states and internationally in Australia, Germany, Poland, and South Korea. We currently have projects to work with the elders on the Navajo Nation in New Mexico, with Tallahatchie General Hospital in the Delta in Mississippi, and at Fishkill Correctional Facility in upstate New York, which is one of the only prisons in the U.S. to have a unit for people living with memory loss. So today what I want to do is to share a few techniques that we use with the Alzheimer's Poetry Project that hopefully will be of use to you in your work or with your loved one. So the artistic focus of the Alzheimer's Poetry Project is on participant creativity. We build the sessions around classic, well-loved poems. As an example, M. Lazarus' poem, New Colossus, which celebrates the Statue of Liberty, with the famous lines, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free." So we group the poems by theme, and we reinforce the theme with props that have a texture or a fragrance. For instance, for a prop for a summer theme, we might use roses, so the person could feel the petals of the rose and smell the rose. To engage people in performance, we use call and response. And this is our main technique we use. So we recite a line from the poem, and we coach the group or the person to echo the line. This use of repetition builds on poetry's strength as an oral art form. And we find call and response throughout our culture. Almost all religious ceremonies have an element of call and response, including our marriage vows. Blues, jazz, gospel have call and response built into their styles, and cheerleaders use call and response to excite sports fans. When we're babies, we start to learn language by tracking our parents' faces, mouths, sounds, and imitating them. And call and response can be a powerful tool to use in communicating with people living with memory loss. We also use touch therapy. We often hold the hands of the person, moving their hands lightly to reinforce the rhythm of the poem. We use funny poems, and we encourage the people's humor. In creating poems, we draw inspiration from the classic poems, and we generate lines of original poetry by asking the participants open-ended questions around the theme and writing down their comments. This is really similar to the method that TimeSlips uses to create stories that Ann will talk about in a moment. So listening skills are crucial in creating the new poems. Using the exact language of the participants instead of paraphrases helps to strengthen the text. And we end the session with the performance of the newly created poem, again using the call and response technique. So we found these methods can be adapted to working one-on-one with people in home settings. I want to talk now just briefly about some of the research projects we're involved in. Last year, we were honored to have a scholar from the Netherlands, Ahe Swinnen. She was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to study the Alzheimer's Poetry Project for 6 months. And I'm really excited to say that the paper that she wrote, Healing Words, a study of poetry interventions in dementia care, was published last November in Dementia, an internationally peer-reviewed journal. So Professor Swinnen found, and I'm going to quote briefly from her paper, it is the ongoing exchange between performer and participants who simultaneously produce and consume poetry that comfort is found not only for people with dementia, but for the poet-performer as well, which emphasizes a major goal of the Alzheimer's Poetry Project in that both people living with memory loss and caregivers benefit from the creative exchange. We've also recently worked with Dr. Medeiros on a pilot project to study the Alzheimer's Poetry Project and to look at innovative ways to undertake studying dementia arts. And this has just been completed, and I'll let her talk a little bit more about what the pilot project found. So while participating in the arts will not change the course of Alzheimer's disease, I have seen people respond to poems with smiles, laughter, and joy for over 10 years in hundreds and hundreds of poetry sessions. Entering the room for the poetry session, you often find the people sitting alone, appearing withdrawn, and they engage as they perform and create poetry, helps to reinforce their dignity as humans. So from the many programs for dementia arts, including Meet Me at MoMA, many museums have dementia arts programs. Mark Morris Dance Company has Dance for Parkinson's, the film Alive Inside, to the National Center for Creative Aging, and groups like New York-based Elder Share the Arts, to leaders like Ann Basting with TimeSlips Storytelling and her incredibly innovative, groundbreaking theater projects. Just to name a few, there's a movement in evidence-based creative aging that's reshaping how we view the aging process and changing how we view living with memory loss. I'm really excited to say that National Center for Creative Aging is launching a caregiver toolkit to do arts projects, and that's going to be launched next week as part of their conference, and I'm proud to be part of that, as well as Ann is part of that as well. So this is my call for all the major advocacy groups for Alzheimer's disease and related dementia, for the National Institute of Health, the National Endowment for the Arts, for elected representatives, foundations, philanthropists, to dedicate a percentage of their budgets to creative aging research and programs, for doctors and gerontologists, upon diagnosis, to give a prescription to a local creative aging program. And our response as artists, as scientists, as people, as caregivers, as advocacy groups like Us Against Alzheimer's will show that we value all members of our community, including those learning how to navigate memory loss now, today. This is what we can do to help them today. And I'm going to close with a poem written by Heidi Hankins from Charleston Middle School in Mississippi, who participated in an intergenerational program at Tallahatchie General Hospital. And Heidi says this. She says, shaking youthful hands with wrinkled hands, knowing one day my hair will be as white as theirs, one day I might need young smiles with mouth full of teeth to smile at me, an extra boost to make me smile. Shaking youthful hands with wrinkled hands is what changed my life. So I want to thank the NEA and Us Against Alzheimer's and all the people on the call. It's been an honor to be with you today.
Well, thank you, Gary. That was excellent, both informative but also it's self-inspiring. So I appreciate that. Next, we're going to hear from Ann Basting, as a founder and director of TimeSlips and professor of theater at the Peck School of the Arts. She's the author of Forget Memory, Creating Better Lives for People with Dementia. And we're excited to hear more about your work.
Thanks so much, George. And I just want to give a great here to Gary. We travel in the same circles, and I think we inspire each other's work, and his call to action is one that I echo strongly. I want to tell you where I am right now, which is sitting at my desk at the university, having just finished grading my storytelling class. And this storytelling class is a group of mostly 18-year-olds who are, excited and nervous about storytelling. And at the beginning of the semester, the first thing I tell them is I said, raise your hand if you're human? And they all, of course, raise their hands. And I say, congratulations, you are already a storyteller. Storytelling is innate to the human species. We understand ourselves through narrative and through storytelling. We connect with each other. That's how we understand each other and share ourselves and empathize with each other. Storytelling is also how we connect across history and other generations. We keep stories alive from generation to generation. And you might all be thinking about your table at holidays and how family members who've gone by or previous generations come alive as we conjure them through storytelling at holidays with family. But this thing happens when we get memory loss, when we get the symptoms of dementia and Alzheimer's, that we start to struggle with the ability to keep a story in a linear track with rational language of what happened when and in what order. And when that happens, people can start to doubt their capacity to control the story, to use that mechanism to understand who they are, how to connect to other people through story. They can see in other people's eyes that something's not right, the word isn't right, the order isn't right. And so what can happen is that this gradual sort of internalization, self-editing, cutting oneself off from storytelling essentially becomes a disease of isolation, that they lose the capacity to understand and use that to understand who they are, to connect to other people, family and friends and community, and also to figure out their place in human history and life beyond their immediate circle. How can we bring that back to them? How can we bring that powerful tool of storytelling back to people who are struggling with memory loss and the symptoms of Alzheimer's? What we can do is a pretty simple shift from expecting rational language and the linear quality of those stories, to shift from the expectation of memory toward an opening and an expectation of imagination. I want to just paint a little picture like Gary did, I think, of how I'll walk into a group of people with memory loss and work with them to use story in this way. And what I would do is bring in, say, if you imagine a group of people sitting in a circle and you have a big pad of paper and you have a marker and you bring in a prompt of some sort to prompt a story. That prompt can be, as Gary said in museums, a picture on a wall. It can be an object. It can be a question. It can be a theme. Commonly, what I'll use is an image. One of the first times I did this, I tore a picture of the Marlboro Man out of a magazine, and I brought it in. And instead of asking them, who is this, or tell me about the Marlboro Man, I shifted expectation of memory toward opening it to imagination. And I said, who do you want to call this person? Where do you want to say this takes place? When do you want to say this takes place? What do you want to say is happening? And with those very few opening questions, we created a 45-minute story that was about Fred Astaire, who's married to Gina Autry, and they live in Oklahoma, and then we sang the song of Oklahoma. We went on and on and on about their family and their pets, and certainly infused into that story were elements of their own stories and their own lives. But when it's framed in the framework of imagination There's no pressure. They could experiment with whatever communication tools they had. They could use sound. They could use song. They could use gesture, whatever they wanted to do. They could use facial expression. And so you're opening up and seeing whatever skills that person has or strengths that person has left to communicate. You're encouraging them to use them, and you're connecting with them on those terms from where they are. So TimeSlips creates that shift. It's deceptively simple, from expecting memory to inviting imagination. And it is in that imagination that we can connect with people with cognitive disabilities like dementia. And I just want to outline the real key core elements of that approach. And there are some similarities. Gary and I work very similarly. What we do is we start with accepting the person where they are. We invite them into creating a story with open-ended questions. We affirm all responses, words, sounds, songs, movements, all of those things I said. We echo and repeat them as though they are teaching us a new language. So we want to make sure that they know they've been heard. We retell that story and show that they are building something and making something together. And then we share that story with others in order to demonstrate their value and, in turn, the value of the person with dementia. So TimeSlips began way back in 1998, using that improvisational story technique in story circles in adult day, in nursing homes, in assisted living, all over the place. We've also worked in independent apartment buildings. We've worked in many, many, many different places, museums as well. We now have a website full of resources for families, for students, for volunteers, and for professionals. We're now an independent nonprofit after being incubated in a university for about 10 years with online storytelling training for individuals and organizations. We have on that website free storytelling game software that you can use to create your own stories. And a really important part of that is a collaborate button. Families, especially those who are separated across the miles, so rarely have something positive to do together because communication can become so tricky, and they usually only bond together over crisis management of care. It's very difficult to connect in a positive way over the miles. So we created that collaborate button to invite a daughter in Utah to collaborate on a creative story with someone in New York or wherever you are. You can do it internationally to build through the imagination something together, to have a new memory and a new story to share together. You can also read stories from all over the world, which is pretty inspiring as well. And then also, Gary mentioned too that we use stories to build community and use this process as a core process to integrate into programming, either in the congregate care setting or in the home setting. We've also reached out to people living at home in order to integrate and help them feel like they're building a larger project together. It's that key component to meaningfulness that connects an individual person's identity with a group of people beyond themselves, like that purpose of what am I beyond the next generation? How can I contribute and leave a legacy? So we've used that approach to build plays, to build art exhibits, to build all kinds of different large-scale projects that people can feel like they're pouring their effort and their energy into and connecting with other people to do it. The imagination really gives us more than a program to add on top of our already busy lives. It gives us a way of being in relationship to each other, that to open our minds and connect with other people and not correct each other. To connect instead of correct, I think, is a really important phrase that reorients that care relationship to being one based on strength and individuality. Our goal really is to get this approach and the other like-minded approaches like Gary's and other folks you've heard about to be standard practice in dementia care. And that'll take all the training and advocacy that you can muster.
Well, thank you so very much, Ann. It's actually quite inspiring to hear how you have taken this and the fascinating ways in which you allow persons with cognitive impairment to build their own stories or participate in the building of stories with others. We do have a question here online, actually, because goes right to what you're talking about. So Sally Dillon asks online, so should you correct the patient who is telling the story incorrectly or allow him or her to tell it as he wants? And I think you answered that in this. They allow the person to go where they go?
Yeah, I think Gary and I would both answer it the same way. I'll let Gary mention it, but it's really about accepting where the person is. Correcting shuts down the entire process. What we're doing is inviting the person from where they are to express in whatever way they can. Even if the language might not make sense to you, you echo it for the internal sense of it, the emotion of it in some way, and incorporate that into the larger sense of the story.
It's fascinating. Let's make sure we get Kate in here and give her her time, because I think we ought to then open it up and have a conversation and bring in some questions. Our final speaker today is Kate de Medeiros. She's the Robert H. and Nancy J. Blayney Professor of Gerontology at Miami University in Ohio. She recently published the book Narrative Gerontology in Research and Practice. So her research has looked at various aspects of dementia to include social environment, behaviors, and arts-based programs, such as the Alzheimer's Poetry Project that we've heard about from Gary. So, Anne, thank you for being, Kate, thank you for being here with us today. Appreciate your being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really such a great honor to be part of this really, really exciting program. And as you've mentioned, as a gerontologist, I come to this topic as someone who's done really different types of research with people with dementia. Today I wanted to focus on 4 broad areas that I feel frame discussions about research on the participatory arts and dementia in particular. And the first one is on how the person with dementia and what that person is experiencing from the day-to-day often gets framed in the context of medicalized language. And I think this is important to think about. Dr. Steve Sabat, who's a cognitive psychologist from Georgetown, writes a lot about this topic in the context of what he calls the fundamental attribution error. And what that means is that what happens when a person gets a diagnosis, then everything subsequently gets framed within that diagnosis, even though the day before that diagnosis it might have been framed differently. For an example, if I were to suddenly be uninterested or bored in something, people might simply just say that I'm bored or uninterested. But if I had a diagnosis of something like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's, then my boredom or lack of interest might now be described as something like apathy or depression. If I'm antsy or fidgety, without a diagnosis, I might just be busy or, again, bored or whatever. But if I have a diagnosis, then I might suddenly become agitated. And so I'm not in any way suggesting that these behavioral changes aren't real, but rather that the meaning of these actions and the responses to these actions can end up being framed in really the medical context only. You know, that's just part of the disease. That's what you can expect, rather than in that larger framework of the person needing something more enriching in their lives and in their days. I mean, when you think about it, if a person's entire life world is limited to a few rooms, so whether that's at home or in a long-term care facility, they might very easily become bored or antsy or some of the other things that can lead to then what we think about as behavioral disturbances. So my first point really is that the participatory arts have the potential to address the issue of having something worthwhile to do in a day by presenting new experiential opportunities. And this is something that often gets lost when we think about dementia from just purely the medical aspect of disease and disease process. And so the second point I want to make builds on this, and it's really what Anne and Gary have talked about already, and that's the importance that creativity and meaning-making play in dementia care. You know, the life world of people with dementia and their carers becomes increasingly smaller with time. You know, fewer opportunities to leave home, fewer chances to visit with people, fewer chances to have meaningful conversations that go beyond questions like, would you like some coffee, or how did you like that program? And as both folks have mentioned, and as we all know, communicating with somebody with dementia can be extremely difficult. You know, language abilities decline as dementia progresses, and someone might be experiencing hearing loss on top of that. Changes in memory and orientation can make conversations difficult. And sometimes it's hard to even think about what to say to someone with dementia. Conversations get awkward, and then subsequently they can end up turning into just question and answer sessions instead of conversations, or they just go away. And so that's where the improvisation and the novel ways of communicating that Ann and Gary mentioned really come in. So things like in Gary's program, call and response poetry, where somebody repeats a portion of a poem, or where they create a new poem, or this group storytelling, can change what's possible in a communication way, but it also can increase interest, decrease boredom, stimulate thought, and perhaps have an effect on those things that we call behavioral disturbances. So the third thing that I wanted to talk about was then the way that we think about research, and specifically research on the effectiveness of arts interventions in dementia settings. And that includes what we consider to be a successful intervention. And so in research in general, the gold standard of treatment research is the randomized control trial. So that's the basic structure for doing drug research, where some initial form of measurement takes place. So say you assess memory at the start of the study, and then as the name implies, study volunteers get randomly assigned to some sort of a treatment group and some to another group. So if you're testing a new medication, you might be assigned to either that new medication or to some traditional therapy. And then, after a given period of time, you're retested, maybe several times, so that the researcher can determine, one, if any of the changes that are seen might be linked to the treatment rather than just being by chance or coincidental. And in some studies, it depends. They might be interested in seeing how long those changes last. So features of these kinds of studies, these randomized control trials, are they have large sample sizes because they need to be big enough to have statistically meaningful results. So 100-plus people generally, and usually much, much bigger than that. And then often the researchers are blinded to who got which treatment. So that way it helps to eliminate bias. So this is great with medications, and it's very effective. You don't have to be interested in a pill to have it be effective on you. It was designed, to have a chemical reaction of some sort, and that's what its purpose is. But then when you think about programs like TimeSlips or Alzheimer's, and you think about research, you think, well, how do you go about testing that effectiveness? And that speaks to this big conundrum of testing and of research that we see in the participatory arts. So, this idea of a large sample size, for one, is problematic. Dementia care facilities vary in size. They're usually often 20 people or fewer, even within larger facilities. The population is changing constantly because of illness, people moving in and out, people passing away. The nature of the intervention, so doing Gary's poetry or Ann's TimeSlips, doesn't lend itself to being able to just randomize people across groups without expecting some kind of spillover or people to engage with each other. These things are done in groups. They're not done in isolation. So that's one huge challenge in this whole research realm. So the second major challenge is, what is a successful result from participating in this? What can you expect? Is it going to improve your memory? Is it going to improve well-being, happiness? How are we going to measure that? Will everyone respond in the same way? What if I don't like poetry and I don't respond? Does that mean it's not effective? What constitutes a dose of poetry? What counts as evidence? These are things that are really challenging and that we really, really need to think through. And just to give you a brief example, Gary mentioned the pilot study that we did with his poetry project here. And what we did is we focused on looking at a small group of people with dementia. We spent time to see what they did in the morning, the time that we would do the intervention. And we found that they would come in, be fed. So the activities person would offer them a beverage. Then people would generally appear to be dozing. The activity person might then read some articles from the newspaper to them, again, limited, often really non-discernible interaction. And then, and that was kind of a day. And so we brought the poetry in and found that things happened very quickly. People might start talking to each other. People who you thought were asleep really weren't. They were quite awake. Their eyes were just closed. And so it was really interesting to try to capture what was happening. We couldn't just go in with a survey and make some check marks. marks. But there were many, many, many things. And the one thing we did find was this potential for communicating with each other. And this is people with dementia communicating with other people with dementia. So this new social connectivity and this idea of communication. And these are really exciting things, I think, to look for in the future, but they're difficult. So this points to some of this third challenge in this dementia research, and that's money. Who's going to fund this type of research? There are a lot of people who are really interested and should be interested in funding cures and treatments. But in reality, the designs that are going to test these arts interventions are actually quite expensive and labor intensive, and that's not the kind of money that goes towards these types of things. Samples aren't easy to get, and again, it's geographical areas sometimes are wide in order to get a significant number of people. So it's just another thing to think about when we think about now, how do we measure and how can we go about looking at it? So just to sum up, the takeaway messages, I think, from research and participatory art programs is that just because there isn't clinical research to support that it's effective doesn't mean that it's not effective. So just because we don't have randomized controlled trials doesn't mean it's not effective. And in fact, a lot of randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews that look at drug interventions don't find that they're very effective either, and they come with really horrible side effects. So I don't believe that anyone's ever died from a dose of poetry, although I can't say that for certain. The other thing is there's a lot of a catch-22 when it comes to research. So you need funding to measure the effectiveness, but you can't get the funding because there's no existing studies on effectiveness. So this is a challenge that I know several people like myself keep running into. We need partnerships with experienced researchers and artists so that we can think collectively on how to redesign research so that it's still robust and rigorous, but that it's appropriate to what we're measuring. And then finally, if we're going to really make a difference in the lives of people living with dementia, I think we need to think beyond the boundaries of medicine alone and that medicalization of experience and really look to the wider potential of experience like the kind that Anne and Gary talk about and how that might affect change. So thank you again for having me.
Well, that was fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating because I had just gotten back from speaking at the convention of the Assisted Living Federation. So this is 2,600 people sitting in a very large room and talking about, they weren't talking, I was talking, about what we ought to be doing with that industry in terms of research. Because, in fact, there are a number of reports of rather systematic maintenance and indeed some improvement in the cognitive performance of individuals in better care settings than in worse. And so the question arose, how does one systematically capture that result, and how does one measure its value so that it will be paid for by the medical system? So your medicalization question really hit home. And so what we're, I think, going to try and do with some technology companies is to be able to use wearable and technologies and other mobile technologies to be able to track people on a continuous and passive basis to determine through time what kinds of interventions actually affect short-term or longer-term health outcomes, whether quality of life or quality of care or cost reductions in terms of hospital admissions or acute incidents or the other things. So this difficulty, this challenge of measuring care interventions, I think we're going to try and get at, it's us against Alzheimer's and the assisted living industry. But you're absolutely right. Each of those residences, in each of them themselves, is pretty small. So trying to do it across an industry is a way that we're going to try and attack that larger problem, but that is not necessarily a placebo-controlled analog. So I totally agree with you. All of you have raised fascinating questions and made fascinating and interesting observations. Just want to remind people who are on the phone, if you have a question, please press *3. And by pressing *3, you'll be placed into a question queue. Please have your question ready to share with us briefly and with a member of our staff. Again, if you're listening online, type your question in the box provided. I'd like a comment from whoever would like to respond to this, and it may be Sunil. People have sent in questions about music and how either listening to music, participating in music, or otherwise, engaging in some music-related activity can improve, short-term or long-term feelings of wellness or health. So I'm going to start with Sunil, and anyone else can comment on it if they wish.
Sure, George. Happy to take a crack at that. Well, it turns out, we've seen studies, and I think one of the speakers may have referred to this, studies looking at music in improving movement and gait, particularly with people with Parkinson's disease and neurodegenerative types of diseases. So that's been very promising. But in terms of, one of the things I wanted to point out is that there have been some really fascinating studies, particularly neurocognitive studies, looking at how music has been associated with memory retention throughout the lifespan, particularly among older adults. So even if we're not talking, even in this case, we may be talking about people who are not already afflicted by dementia, for example, but healthy, so-called healthy adults, we find that they seem to be able to, there seems to be a correlation between memory retention and auditory memory, particularly in those who are, say, practicing musicians and who practice regularly. It turns out there's some work by a woman named Nina Kraus from Northwestern University who's done some fascinating work. She was actually featured in that National Academy of Sciences NEA workshop as one of the speakers, and she showed us some really great results, and she's published results looking at the link between music and listening and music playing and on the one hand and memory retention and particularly auditory memory in older adults.
We obviously saw with the Glenn Campbell documentary the capacity of an individual who may even be in mild or beyond and moderate stage Alzheimer's, who may not know where he is off stage, but when he got on stage and was playing the guitar, whether it's just muscle memory or whether other kinds of memory, he was able to perform at a very, very high level. So this notion of somehow your own history being a piece of your memory. And we've seen, I think, at least anecdotally, that you mentioned the poem that connected with your grandmother, that in fact people who from the African American community or from other religious communities who remember religious songs or gospel singing or others that will connect to songs in the 50s or 40s because that's the song from their childhood. So finding sort of the mechanism by which you deliver the memories that are still there in long-term memory through new technology or otherwise through simply deep interviewing that connect to each individual something different about music and their own history is, I think, one of the great frontiers here on how to develop personalized care programs that really have plumbed the individual's history, the relationships, and other aspects of what may be in their memory and what may remind them and keep them purposeful and, as you said, reducing isolation. There's a comment here. We got two online. One is, how can arts programs and related services become better integrated into regular primary care? Of course, primary care is a phrase out of the medical world, but how can we get arts programs and related services more into home-based or people living in the community? Let's say Kate. I'm going to start, and we'll get comments from anyone else who wishes to comment.
Well, I think first it's educating providers about the usefulness. So again, I think we get in this conundrum of I want to see the efficacy and thinking in that way, when in reality, again, it's not like it's going to damage anyone by participating, but the arts need to be viewed as something that's worthwhile and not a simple pastime. And I think that requires education and thinking beyond, the prescription mentality that I think pervades the system because of reimbursements, as you've mentioned. So I think getting the word out there is definitely key as someone mentioned, I think it was Gary, it'd be great if somebody could suggest to a family, to be involved in a local arts program or to take advantage of the local museum as part of the care treatment for somebody with dementia.
This is Anne. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Anne.
I was just going to join in on that and say that I think we're starting to see a groundswell of this happening. We know that the vast majority of people living with symptoms of Alzheimer's or dementia are living in the community. They're not in congregate care settings, and they are. We're starting that movement to make dementia friendly communities where the places that you've been going your whole life for community and cultural stimulation and arts and creativity and the life of your community, they don't need to stop just because someone gets a diagnosis. So museums across the country are really starting to open up their education programs to working with families with memory loss. Libraries are starting to be a resource in that direction. I worked on a project that another adaptation of TimeSlips, working with home-delivered meal services and large-scale volunteer organizations that go out to work with people living in their homes to figure out what is that simplest invitation to be creative that where people don't say no because they spent their whole lives saying I'm not a creative person. But it's just that little invitation to express in some way that's a little out of the ordinary that gets them to kind of jump the track of their usual conversations. So we created a whole system of questions of the day that were worded poetically that people could respond to on a little card that came with a home-delivered meal or through a telephone reassurance program or through a volunteer who came and sat with them to keep them company. All of those different approaches of getting out into the home in order to bring out the expression and the connection, create connection for people living alone or who are starting to experience those symptoms, or people who might have some support networks, but family in place checking on them, but they're living with symptoms of dementia as well at home. That I should say that project was called the Islands of Milwaukee. We're shifting it into being called Arts at Home. But you can find that at islandsofmilwaukee.org, and all the questions are there, all the radio podcasts we created out of the answers. You can see tons of stuff on that there as well.
We have a comment.
I'd just like to say briefly in response to this is we have an event in Brooklyn called the Memory Arts Cafe, and we work with local physicians where they can direct someone who's just gotten a diagnosis to attend these monthly events. And there's a number of memory cafes around the country. There's over 100 now. But I'd like to say for myself, out of this call, I would like to take this on and try to, to get physicians and gerontologists to know about this, the different creative arts projects, and that they can make a prescription to join one of these groups, because there's so little that they can actually offer the families, and I think that would be an important thing that comes out of our conversation today.
We are developing a dementia-friendly America initiative in which we're going to develop and work with a number of pilot communities who will take this on in a serious way, this notion of developing a dementia-friendly community. And you've now introduced the systematic effort to get arts into that, and I think that's a really great idea. We have a comment here from Cheryl Croce, I guess, or Gross. I've benefited using music therapy myself, sing-alongs and other sensory interventions in reducing behaviors during sundowning periods and found it beneficial. So, you're striking a chord among those people who are responding online. I think we have a few more questions, but I think we're running out of time. And I want to thank all of the panelists. Sunil, thank you for helping us put this together, and the NEA for helping us put this together. But thank you also, Gary and Anne and Kate. Thank you to everyone on the phone, and I'm sorry I couldn't get to some of your questions, although Holly, the answer is for your question about options for people in rural areas to participate in clinical trials, a little off topic here. That is a great challenge, and some doctors that I've been talking with in clinical trial sites have been thinking about mobile clinical site participation. So I just wanted to let you know that I wasn't ignoring your question. Thank you to everyone on the phone or online for participating today. In about a week, we'll have a copy of this recording and a transcript on our website for you to share with your friends. Us Against Alzheimer's and our network members have long recognized that the arts represent a powerful medium to bring attention, focus, and light to the topic of Alzheimer's, but also to bring a connectivity to those with cognitive deficits that we may not be able to reach through, as one of the panelists has said, sort of rational discussion. We know that arts can be a platform for change as well, and so we're looking to engage arts in a variety of form as a way of reducing stigma more generally and to engaging more people more broadly in at least being open and willing to discuss the disease and how they might make the lives of those with the disease as helpful, fruitful, and respectful as we can. We are forming a new effort to galvanize artists across the globe who want to help us bring Alzheimer's out of the shadows. We ourselves are in the planning stages, but we're confident that creating a clearinghouse, as one person online said, in England, in London, there is an organization called Arts for Dementia, sort of a clearinghouse for bringing together artists in all of their different forms and in all of the positive ways that they can have an impact into one, I'm not going to say a place, but at least a virtual environment where we can test the impact of different art therapy interventions and where we can compare and contrast with individuals' differential reactions to different kinds of arts experiences as a way to improve their well-being. As I say, we're in the planning stages, but are confident that the new initiative will give not only more voice to Alzheimer's, engage more people in the fight, but also bring a greater sense of well-being to those that are experiencing the disease. And quite frankly, we should mention the caregivers who in themselves are going through the experience of Alzheimer's. Thanks again to the NEA for being with us today as we explore this topic, and I think we'll be back in touch, Sunil, about bringing together, the people you deal with and the research approaches that we may be exploring here. Fully mindful of all the research methodological questions that you cannot automatically transport to this field, and also to the obvious point that, in fact, arts can't hurt. Our next call will be on Thursday, June 25, from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern, and will feature Dr. Katrin Andreessen, Professor of Neurology at Stanford University Medical Center. You may have seen some recent press about her interesting research. She's able to reverse memory loss in mice by focusing on the microglia, also known as the immune cells in the brain. She'll be joining us next month to talk about her fascinating research. As always, please stay on the line if you'd like to leave a message with a question or comment. We're particularly interested in what you would like to discuss on future calls. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Sunil. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.